Hello everybody, Toreno here, and today we are taking another look at more US tanks that still need adding to War Thunder. If you haven't seen part 1 of this series, I recommend you go watch that episode as well, the link for which you can find in the description below. So with that out of the way, let's get into the video. The first US vehicle we will be looking at is the M7 Priest, an American self-propelled gun and probably one of the most well-known and iconic Allied SPGs of World War II. To clear up any potential confusion, its US designation was M7 105mm Howitzer Motor Carriage, or HMC, but it is usually known as the M7 Priest, this being its designation within the British Army, based on the British naming convention of giving religious names to its SPGs and its machine gun mount resembling a priest's pulpit. The M7 Priest was initially based on the M3 Lee's chassis, before transitioning to the M4 Sherman chassis, and was a great improvement over previous HMCs like the T19, which had been based on half-tracks, which had the disadvantage of being unarmoured and not being as good as a fully tracked vehicle with regards to off-road mobility. The main armament of the M7 Priest was the M2A1 105mm howitzer, which was very similar to the M4 105mm howitzer as used by the M4A3 105 in-game. It is capable of firing various ammunition types, including smoke, M1HE shells with an in-game penetration of 27mm, and the M67 heat shell, giving an in-game penetration of 130mm at a 0° angle, making this a pretty effective tank killer, especially at the lower tiers. Additionally, the horizontal traverse of the M2A1 was 15 degrees to the left and 30 degrees to the right, with an elevation of plus 35 to minus 5 degrees. In addition to this main armament, the M7 Priest was armed with one 50 caliber machine gun in a rather distinctive machine gun mount, which gives it good visibility and a 360-degree firing arc, meaning the M7 Priest can somewhat decently defend itself from lightly armoured vehicles while deterring direct attacks from the air. Armour is okay, with a maximum armour thickness of 51mm, though of course the big weakness is the open-topped fighting compartment, making it extremely vulnerable to enemy aircraft, though the superstructure does provide some protection from ground fire. Mobility is pretty good, with a max speed of 24 mph or 39 km/h, allowing the M7 to quickly relocate itself across the battlefield and escape dangerous situations. Lastly, the crew numbered 8, consisting of a driver in the hull and a gunner and his assistant, the commander, and 4 loaders in the fighting compartment. Now, finding a place for the M7 Priest in the US tech tree might be a bit difficult, as the US tech tree doesn't really have many howitzer armed vehicles, with the only 2 in the lower tiers being the M4A3 105 in the heavy tank lineup and the M8 HMC in the tank destroyer line. Personally, I think the M7 Priest could be added at a battle rating of 2.0 to 2.3, probably after the M3 GMC, or alternatively it could go between the M22 and M4A3 105. Overall, I think the M7 Priest would be a very welcome addition to the US tech tree, giving us a vehicle and weapon that America doesn't really have an equivalent of in-game at the moment, allowing US players to try out a new playstyle and learn more about this SPG while being a great boon to War Thunder. We now come to another M7, this time the M7 Medium Tank, a tank design that, while not the worst in the world, ended up wholly unsuited to its originally designed role due to a combination of design creep and changing design requirements. Surprisingly, the M7 started life in January 1942 as the T7 and was actually an attempt to design a light tank to replace the M3 and M5 Stuart, with a specification of being armed with a 37mm gun, a maximum armour thickness of 38mm, and not weighing more than 14 tons, so basically a slightly improved version of the tanks it was supposed to replace. However, as development went on and various prototypes were produced, design creep began to crop up, with a bit of extra armour here, new gun there, and various other changes until finally the 6th prototype, the T7E5, weighed in at a whopping 29 tons with a full combat load, bearing in mind its original specification was 14 tons. It also had a crew complement of 5, which was the same as the M4 Sherman, the same M3 75mm gun as the M4 Sherman, 64mm of armour, far in excess of that required for a light tank, but worse than the M4 Sherman, while also having a top speed of 30 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour. Too slow for the light tank role it was originally designed for, and not much faster than, you guessed it, the M4 Sherman. The end result of this was that when the T7E5 was given the M7 designation, it was designated as a medium tank rather than a light tank. Now, to be fair to the designers, there does seem to have been some meddling by Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, the commander of the Armoured Force, who saw the potential for the new tank to be a universal tank, capable of replacing the current light tanks and the M3 Lee, and possibly even the M4 Sherman. To this end, in August 1942, 3,000 M7s were ordered and an entire tank plant was constructed for this purpose. But in 1943, after only 7 tanks were constructed, the M7 program was cancelled, for the simple reason that it was completely inferior to the already in production M4 Sherman, while still being unable to fulfill the originally designed for light tank role, which would eventually be filled by the M24 Chaffee in late 1944. But until that point, US forces were left to rely on their thoroughly obsolete M3 and M5 Stuarts. So, having heard the history of the tank, we have to ask why and how it should be added to War Thunder. Now, I can't see this being added to the regular US tank tech tree, as despite a few of these being built, it never actually saw any combat service, leaving this tank more suitable as a premium or event tank, or perhaps even as a battle pass prize. As for where it could go with regards to battle rating, I would suggest perhaps around 3.0, which would be between the M3 Lee and the M4A1 Sherman. My logic for this is based on the M7's inferior stats to the M4A1 Sherman and its advantages over the M3 Lee, as it has the same gun as the M4A1 Sherman, given a penetration of 90mm at 500m with APC-BC shells, plus 3 30 caliber machine guns, while having inferior armour to both tanks, maxing out at 64mm on the mantlet, 51mm on the turret front, and 38mm at a 50-degree angle for the whole front. However, it does retain a slight speed advantage of 30 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour, which is about 6 miles per hour better than both the M4A1 and M3, while also having a crew complement of 5, consisting of a driver and bow machine gunner in the hull, and a gunner, loader and commander in the turret. In many ways, these stats make the M7 a slightly inferior M4A1, but with its turret and faster speed, it would still be superior to the M3 Lee. If added, I could see the M7 having a role as a slower but beefed up M24, having good firepower for its tier, while being faster than competitor medium tanks. Overall, I think this could be a cool tank with a unique playstyle, and while a largely unknown tank today, I think it could have some decent success in War Thunder, and I think it would be a fun tank to play. The next vehicle we will be looking at is the M9 Tank Destroyer, a stopgap vehicle that was planned to be produced in small numbers to make use of existing 3-inch guns, while development of the M10 Tank Destroyer was ongoing. This design started off with the designation T24, and was based on the M3 Lee chassis, with most of the upper hull removed in order to fit a new open-topped fighting compartment. This original design was ready for testing by November 1941, but it was clear it had some issues, primarily related to being too tall, so the prototype was rebuilt and redesignated as the T40, and would later be given the designation of M9. The M9 was armed with the 3-inch M1918, which as the name suggests, dates to 1918, and it was originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon. This weapon would later be developed into the 3-inch M7 as used on the M10, but the weapon to be used on the M9 was to be the largely unaltered original anti-aircraft gun. Now, I'll admit I haven't actually found any concrete figures for armour penetration for this weapon, but looking through some old US Army Ordnance handbooks, we can see that the muzzle velocity of the M1918 is 2,400 feet a second, compared to the M7 3-inch gun, which in-game has a muzzle velocity of 2,598 feet a second. So it would be worse than the modern gun, but not drastically so. The main issue will be with regards to which shells are used, for which I admittedly haven't found any information on. Assuming it uses the M79 AP shell at a bare minimum, we are probably looking at an armour penetration figure a little worse than the M7's 121mm at 500 metres, giving the M1918 maybe around 100 to 110mm of penetration, still capable of punching through the armour of most tanks in the lower tiers. Lastly, it has a horizontal traverse of 27 degrees to the right and 10 degrees to the left, with an elevation of plus 29 degrees to minus 8 degrees, and a capacity of 40 rounds of ammunition. Armour is broadly the same as the M3 Lee, with a maximum thickness of 50.8mm at the front and 38.1mm at the sides and rear. The main fighting compartment itself is open topped, which would make this very vulnerable to attack, especially from aircraft. The M9's mobility was pretty good, with a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, 1 mile per hour faster than the M3 Lee, which makes sense considering the M9 weighs 26.5 tonnes versus the M3 Lee at around 27 tonnes, though it is still slower than the M10, which is capable of a top speed of 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour. Crew complement of the M9 is 5, presumably consisting of 1 driver in the hull and a commander, gunner and 2 loaders in the fighting compartment. Lastly, the M9 is 2.3 meters tall or 7 feet and 6 inches, smaller than the M10 Wolverine, which is 2.9 meters or 9 foot and 6 inches tall, meaning the M9 could potentially be easier to hide in ambush situations. Having been accepted for service, the M9 did come fairly close to being put into a limited production run of about 50 vehicles, but in August 1942 it was found that only 28 guns were actually available to be used. Not to mention the M9s wouldn't be finished until after the far superior M10 Wolverine had entered production. So although the M9 was a pretty good stopgap tank destroyer design, in August 1942 the M9 was cancelled, and just a month later the first 100 M10s would leave the production line, relegating the M9 to obscurity. However, while the M9 was destined to never see service in real life, it is a decent design that could still see some success in War Thunder. If added to War Thunder, I would suggest adding it at a battle rating of 2.7 to 3.0, between the M3 GMC and M10 GMC, probably at tier 2. Overall, while it does suffer from some issues compared to the M10, such as worse mobility and an even more open-topped compartment while not having a turret, it still has a very powerful gun while being in a shorter vehicle, which would aid in concealment. With these advantages, I think this could be a cool alternative tank destroyer to the M10, and one I would love to see added to War Thunder. So, having looked at these tanks, I'd like to hear your opinions on them and what other US tanks you would like to see added to War Thunder, and I'll be interested to read your comments below. So hopefully you'll join me for future episodes looking at both US and other nations' tanks that still need adding to War Thunder. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.